Think about this question for a moment. Either through the course of natural events or acts of humanity, what would happen to you and your family if the sun stopped shining? The fact is that you cannot exist on planet Earth solely on your own. You are equal partners with everything else in the universe, including our sun. From the most minuscule atomic particle to the grandest galaxies, the past, the present, and the future of every animate and inanimate being in our universe, including you, is defined by its relationship with everything else. It is these relationships, these connections in nature, that we're going to talk about in this webinar. One such connection in nature is nature's energy chain that starts with the sun's energy. This energy is received and stored by plants. In eating these plants, animals such as ourselves receive and store this energy in the cells of our bodies. Meat-eating animals receive and store their life energy by eating these creatures who eat plants. In Earth's act of recycling, waste is returned to the earth to become nutrients for more plants. This chain, which we will discuss later in the webinar, is one example of a connection in nature where we are completely dependent on the sun's energy as well as the earth's plants and animals that store that energy. Now think about how the gas tank in your car is connected to your car's engine. Gasoline flows through a piece of tubing from your gas tank to your car's engine. If you were to cut the tubing, your engine would stop running because it could no longer receive the gasoline that contains the energy that your engine needs to operate. Connections in nature are like the gasoline supply tubing in your car that transports energy to your car's engine. Connections in nature are an essential part of our engine of life. Connections in nature are the conduits for transporting energy from one thing in nature to the next, such as in this forest. Energy is the fuel of nature. Without fuel, nature will not operate. Without fuel lines, nature's plants and animals cannot receive the energy that is needed for life to exist. Now, mankind's alteration of ecosystems can impair or destroy connections in nature. This results in impaired or destroyed energy flow. The elimination of keystone predators, gaseous emissions that impair the flow of our sun's energy, the alteration of river systems, and the destruction of forests are examples of how humanity has affected important connections in nature that have resulted in altered energy flow. Said in another way, if nature's gas hose is damaged or destroyed, life is damaged or destroyed. Now, because the connections in nature are the essential energy highways in which nature's energy flow takes place, it's the job of stewards of nature, such as yourselves, to identify, to understand, and to preserve these connections. A conservation strategy of protecting connectivity in nature's ecosystem protects the system's ability to transport energy and utilize energy. A healthy and biodiverse ecosystem uses the many interconnections of the plants and animals within that ecosystem to receive life-giving energy and to transport energy to other species. Since we're going to be talking about ecosystems and biodiversity, let's take a moment to define these terms. An ecosystem is defined as a biological community of interacting organisms and their physical environment. An ecosystem is a complex, interconnected system of energy flow conduits. Now, biodiversity is one of those words that describes something that is always good, but is never really explained. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines biodiversity as the existence of many different kinds of plants and animals in an environment. I've read this definition many times, and I'm always left with the feeling of, so what? But when I probe further and ask why biodiversity is a good thing, I'm told that more plants and animals in an ecosystem provide greater resilience. And the removal of a plant or an animal from the ecosystem could cause some ecological damage. This explanation helps, but we still don't precisely know what biodiversity is all about. Well, a more descriptive definition of biodiversity might be the effect of the interconnectivity of life within an ecosystem. Biodiversity addresses the importance of interconnections between living things because biodiversity facilitates the flow of life-giving energy in nature's ecosystems. One term that you will find when you're searching for definitions of biodiversity is ecological biodiversity. Ecological biodiversity is defined as a variety of ways in which species interact with each other and their environment. So when I use the term biodiversity, I choose to use it to describe the ecological value of relationships within and between species in the ecosystem. Now, we said that energy is the fuel of life. From the smallest cells in our bodies to huge elephant herds, every living thing needs energy to live. The energy that is contained in the living cells of our bodies, in the food that we eat, or in sunlight flows from one organism to the next. We've also said that connections in nature are the conduits for this energy flow. Whenever there's a large or a small group of living things, you will find that nature's communities are connected together in many different ways. It's these relationships that define biodiversity. If plants and animals within an ecosystem have many energy conduits, we can say they live within a biodiverse ecosystem. This means that if one energy connection were within the group of many connections destroyed, chances are small that this act would affect the entire ecosystem. However, if there's only one energy connection between two key elements of an ecosystem, the destruction or alteration of this single energy flow conduit could cause a collapse of energy flow within the ecosystem because of a cascading effect where many species are ultimately destroyed. Now, the honeybee is a key connection in nature because it transports the energy of new life. If this key pollinator of many plants were killed off with pesticides, the human population would be adversely affected because without the honeybee working as a pollinator, parts of our food supply would no longer exist. In order to gain greater knowledge about the relationship between biodiversity and energy flow, let's look deeper into what nature's connections look like. The process of transferring energy in the form of food from one organism to the next is called a food chain. Later, I'll describe the food web, which is a collection of food chains. But let's keep things simple for the moment. Each organism in the food chain receives energy by eating the previous organism in the food chain. This organism provides energy to the next organism in the chain by becoming its food, and so on. This chain of energy flow is vitally important because it is the energy conduit that each organism relies upon for receiving the fuel that it takes to live. Ecologists categorize living things into groups that are defined by how they transform and transport energy. Each definition describes how a group member lives and interacts with other organisms in the group, as well as organisms outside of the group. Ecosystems are made up of some or all of these groups. The group at the beginning of the energy flow chain is called producers. The organisms within this group are all of the plant kingdom, including trees and grass, as well as algae, such as seaweed. The individuals in this group are the primary energy source within an ecosystem because these organisms receive energy from a source outside of this ecosystem, namely our sun. The cells inside of these organisms, using a compound called chlorophyll, transform the sun's energy to produce simple energy storing chemical compounds known as sugars and carbohydrates. This process is known as photosynthesis, and it also produces oxygen that is released into the atmosphere. This is the oxygen that we and other creatures require to sustain life. This is why forests and meadows are so important to life on Earth. This is why we consider deforestation by mankind as a broken connection in nature. Now, herbivores, or plant eaters, are creatures that receive their energy by eating the plants and algae in the producer group. Examples of herbivores are insects, birds, fish, and the pronghorn antelope shown here. Carnivores, or meat eaters, get the energy necessary for life by eating other animals, including herbivores. Carnivores are sometimes called predators. Wolves are a famous predator that eats herbivores such as deer and elk. Omnivores eat both plants and animals. A bear eats both berries and salmon. We humans are omnivores. Now, scavengers receive their energy by consuming the bodies of plants and animals that have died. The turkey vulture, commonly considered to be nature's garbage collector, is a scavenger that gets its energy by eating dead animals. Decomposers, like mushrooms, mildew, mold, and toadstools, are not plants. They're called fungi. They don't have chlorophyll, so they can't make their own food. Fungi absorb the nutrients from the organisms they are decomposing. Fungi release enzymes that decompose dead plants and animals to provide nutrients to the producers, our plant kingdom. Now, parasites live on or in the bodies of living things. They are totally dependent on their host. Examples of parasites are tapeworms and bedbugs. Bedbugs are parasitic insects that feed exclusively on blood. The common bedbug is the best known as it prefers to feed on human blood. Yuck. Now, while we've been talking about ecosystems that thrive above ground in sunlight, there's also highly interconnected ecosystems underground. Much of that forest or meadow we see above ground also resides underground in an invisible world that we can't see without a microscope or some form of chemical analysis. Yet that secret underground world is a vital connecting force that is essential for the maintenance and the survival of what we see above ground, including we humans. Dirt is of fundamental importance for global carbon and nutrient cycles that contributes to ecosystem functioning. We can explain much of the nature that we see above ground from what is happening in the soil. Indeed, we humans are connected to dirt. We need dirt to live. The plants of our forest or the meadow reach outward and upward for air and for light energy from the sun. But these plants also reach downward into the dirt to engage a highly complex, interconnected subterranean ecosystem that supplies physical support, nutrients, and water. In turn, the network of organisms in soil receive carbohydrate from the above ground forests and meadows. Underground systems of fungal threads serve to communicate between plants. They are the internet of the plant world. This is another important example of interconnectivity in nature. Subterranean biodiversity is just as important to your life as the biodiversity we usually see above ground. Well, as you can see from the description of each group, everything depends upon everything else for its supply of energy, which is the fuel of life. Plants need the sun. Herbivores need plants. Carnivores eat herbivores. Decomposers recycle the nutrients of dead organisms into new energy for plants. The recycle continues. Food chains are not just another lesson in your biology class. They are a critical part of your existence. Well, the simple food chain that I just described cannot exist solely on its own. Food chains are part of other food chains. One food chain is simply one path that a creature might take to find and receive food energy. Many creatures are part of more than one food chain because they eat a variety of foods. These interconnected food chains are part of a more complex system of interconnections known as a food web. All organisms in a food chain or a food web have some role to play in the resulting ecosystem. Any change in the connections between organisms can cause problems in the whole food web. From microscopic organisms to the great whales, the image in this slide portrays the complexity of the food web in the southern Atlantic Ocean. That heavy line that runs through the diagram represents the direct energy links between the krill and other creatures. If you look carefully, you will see the energy network that starts with the microorganisms that are eaten by krill and ends with the large whales eating the krill. Throughout that network, other creatures also eat the krill. These creatures are then eaten by other creatures. So what would happen to this large biodiverse ecosystem if the krill were to disappear because of reduced solar energy, or climate change, or other changes in nature due to man's carelessness? Mentally remove that heavy line which represents the food energy connection that krill provides. How many different species would disappear? The humble krill is called a keystone species because it is a vitally important part of the chain of energy flow from small creatures all the way to the great whales. All of these creatures would disappear if the krill disappears. Now, in another example, the current use of pesticides is killing a large number of bees. Bees pollinate a significant majority of the world's food, and these vital pollinators are in serious trouble. In North America alone, honeybees pollinate nearly 95 kinds of fruits and nuts, including almonds, avocados, cranberries, and apples. Humans, animals, and birds rely on the pollination services of bees. But bees and other pollinators are reaching a tipping point, with beekeepers reporting annual losses of a third or more in recent years. This is happening because of the indiscriminate use of chemical pesticides by mankind. These pesticides are breaking an important energy link in the complex network of life. Now, it's important to note that mankind does not cause all changes in nature. It's important to understand that environments are constantly changing on their own without human impact. Ecosystems are in a constant dance as their components compete, react, evolve, migrate, and form new communities. Geological upheaval, evolution, climatic cycles, fire, storms, and population dynamics see to it that nature is always changing. On Hawaii, volcanic activity wipes the slate clean on any given slope every few hundred years, and occasional new arrivals to the islands, washed ashore or drifting in on the wind, adapt to their new home and find a place for themselves in its ecosystem. A healthy, robust environment evolves and adapts to these naturally changing conditions. Even small changes in an ecosystem can have far-reaching effects. These small changes and their effects are humanly impossible to predict. Healthy food webs within ecosystems ensure that biodiversity is supported. This is because healthy food webs have many different connections that can supply the energy of life. If one energy connection were broken, it's likely that many other connections would still be available to supply energy. This characteristic is known as resilience. Resilience is the capacity of a system to deal with changing conditions in a way that is beneficial to the system and the creatures that are part of the system. We humans are just beginning to understand that the relationships between and within animal and plant species are incredibly complex. Science is now beginning to discover that we are unable to predict the future of ecosystems because it is humanly impossible to understand the impact of any human activity on the highly complex relationships that exist in an ecosystem. Healthy, biodiverse ecosystems consist of highly complex energy transportation networks. Any tampering by mankind, no matter how well-meaning, might affect the resilience of a natural system. This is because in a complex system, it's impossible to predict the outcome of any action. Think about the weather for a minute. You might be able to predict the weather up to 10 days in advance, but it would be pure luck if you were able to predict the weather 20, 30, or 40 days in advance. Like nature's weather systems, the complexity of nature's ecosystems prevent an accurate estimate of an event in the future. So if at all possible, it's usually best to let nature do her own thing and let her own complex energy networks take over. So hopefully you are beginning to see a more concrete description of biodiversity and its relationship to the interconnected flow of life and life-giving energy on Earth. Biodiversity is the interconnectivity of nature that defines the existence of every living being on Earth. It is the life support system of all life on Earth. Remember, it's not just the species we are worried about. It is the complex interrelationships between species that need protection. Biodiversity is connectivity. Connectivity is biodiversity. Now, despite our inability to control nature, the one thing that we humans do know is that the highly complex interconnections in nature that we call biodiversity are central to ecosystem functioning and hence the existence and maintenance of all life on Earth. Any loss of biodiversity within any ecosystem is of great concern because we are unable to comprehend all of the relationships between living things within an ecosystem. Yet, the conservation of biodiversity is very important because biodiversity is connectivity. This is why it's so very important to identify, to understand, and to protect any connection in nature before we attempt to change or remove anything within an ecosystem. If we can't identify, if we can't understand, and if we can't protect, we should do nothing. Let's explore a simple example of identifying, understanding, and protecting a connection in nature. Let's examine the connections in a simple plant or tree leaf which you have found and are holding in your hand. The leaf is obviously a physical pattern we can see from its shape. But we quickly see a second pattern, the veins in the leaf. These veins are shaped in a tree-like structure that we call a fractal pattern. These veins serve a purpose. They transport energy to the plant and transport waste gases to the leaf for release into the atmosphere. The leaf is also constructed from plant tissue called cells. These cells are directly or indirectly connected to the veins. They contain chloroplasts, which convert the sun's energy into useful energy for the plant. These cells also bring in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. So through the process of observation and understanding, we've been able to identify two kinds of connections within this leaf. We can continue by asking ourselves the same kind of questions about how the leaf is connected to the trees, how the tree is interconnected with the entire forest and with the earth. As we think things out carefully, we will ultimately see that the leaves, the trees, and the forest are the lungs of the earth that both supply life-giving oxygen and food energy to all creatures, including ourselves. Our analysis results in describing a complex web of connections in nature. We can then take our leaf and ask how each of we humans is connected to this leaf. How are we each connected to the forest, and how each of us is connected to nature? We will find that all humans have many of the same patterns as the leaf and the plant. First, we share some of the same genes. For example, mustard grass has 15% of the genes in the human genome, and our lungs and our kidneys have the same function and structure as the leaf veins. Like the leaf, we inhale our atmosphere and exhale our waste products. And of course, we have cells in our body. The fact is that there is a unity of structures and functions between plants in our forest and within us. There are connections on many levels. We know the forest because we know ourselves. When you hold that leaf, you are holding a little bit of you. When you protect the forest from clear cutting, you are protecting you. When you leave this webinar and find yourself examining how things are interconnected, I'd be ecstatic knowing that I've set the world view of connectivity in motion in your mind. The word consciousness is not just a philosophical, spiritual, hippie, or tree hugger idea. A consciousness about connections in nature is essential to the survival of humanity on this earth. Consciousness means being aware of something. Consciousness means the humility of stewards of nature, such as yourselves, instead of the prevalent, arrogant attitude of many humans and government agencies who wish to control and manage nature. A consciousness about connections in nature means that every time you engage nature, you ask yourself the question of how one creature, plant, or natural object is connected to another and to nature's greater scheme of things. In developing this kind of consciousness, you are automatically becoming a steward of your environment by becoming aware. You are then prepared to take your own appropriate action. The secret to resolving our environmental crises is to develop a consciousness for connections in nature within the ranks of young people. Many environmental organizations now realize that sustainability education is a powerful means to correct the ecological mistakes of the past. Instead of offering the common doomsday approach, environmental education uses stewardship to build a basic consciousness toward connections in nature that will serve as a foundation for sound ecological decisions in the future. As I close this webinar, I wish to share with you the wisdom of a man who will inspire you and help you think about the impact of an interconnection nature on your life and the lives of other human beings. This man received his early university education as a scientist. He was a chemist. But he gained his fame and respect as Pope Francis. Pope Francis emphasizes a connected nature, but on a wider scale that includes the interconnectivity of all parts of human life with nature. This includes mankind's social, cultural, and economic activities. He looks upon environmental education as a connection in nature because it passes a positive and active consciousness for nature from one human generation to the next. Pope Francis says that the world is a gift we have freely received and we must share with others. The world we have received also belongs to those who follow us. The environment is on loan to each generation, which must then hand it to the next, he says. His question is, what kind of world do we want to leave to those who will come after us, to children who are now growing up? Pope Francis is suggesting that, like the sun or a forest, you are an important connection in nature. Yes, you, who is passing your knowledge, your value system, and your energy to future generations. The words of Pope Francis describe the challenge to all environmental educators and stewards of nature, who include the young people who are participating in this webinar. You are an important connection in nature because you have the power to affect the future of nature's environment by sharing yourself with the current generation of humans and helping this generation influence future generations. Both teachers and students who are attending this webinar series have the power to define the future of humanity and our planet. To each of you, I say that this is your challenge and your legacy. I'd like to close my presentation with a short video that I produced that summarizes what we have been talking about today.